Hi there, and welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. We are on the verge of a deal for real this time edition. And yeah, there's several reasons to believe that this time is different and we're headed for an actual deal. A lot of it is just the noise around it is very different from previously. I'm seeing senior Hamas officials come out and talk about the great victory that's coming, the release of the prisoners, the withdrawal of Israel from Gaza, etc. And Netanyahu is briefing in favor of the deal anonymously. So close Israel watchers know that Netanyahu tends to brief journalists by calling himself a senior diplomatic source, and that's how you can sort of tell what result Netanyahu is trying to get to. Sometimes he'll brief against his own deal, which is what happened in late May and early June. This time, Netanyahu is briefing in favor of the deal. Those two things are huge because the leadership has kept some distance from the deal in the past. Now they're embracing it. That, together with the massive pressure coming from the Trump administration, is seeming to have a very serious effect. So, what kind of deal are we looking at? We're looking at a deal with three phases, although phase three has barely been discussed this time, and we'll talk a little bit about why. In phase one, 33 Israeli hostages will be released. Not all of them will be alive, unfortunately, but according to Israeli reports, most of them will be. They'll include all the women, including IDF soldiers. That was a major source of argument in the past, and one of the few achievements that Israel has had in negotiating this deal. The elderly, the sick, and the injured. A lot of people keep asking me about the Bibas children, since they're not mentioned specifically as children. That's a bad sign, and we all know what that probably means. Releases of hostages will start on the first day of the ceasefire, which will continue for 42 days. The last of the 33 hostages will come on the last day. It's not clear if they'll be staggered in groups of one or more, etc., but it is clear that they'll be spread out over those 42 days in order to try to stabilize the situation and stop violations of the ceasefire. I've seen various numbers, but in exchange for those 33, Israel will withdraw somewhere between 1,200 and 1,300 Palestinian prisoners from prison. Many of those prisoners are among the heaviest who have killed the most Israelis. We don't have the details of all the names yet. There have been some vetoes, so there's a few people that Israel said we're not releasing them, and Hamas agreed not to release them. There's going to be no Nukhba prisoners in the first stage. The Nukhba are the Hamas quote unquote commandos who mostly did the heavy lifting in October 7th. So none of them will be released in the first stage, but that implies that some of them may be released in the second stage. Now, there was a big argument over whether the prisoners would be exiled or not. Most of them, not all of them, come from the West Bank, East Jerusalem, that area, and not from Gaza. Hamas wanted them to return to their homes. Israel wanted at least the heavy ones exiled to another country. In the end, it looks like they're all going to be released to Gaza, which means that they will not be exiled and will be a boon to Hamas in Gaza, not only in terms of a political achievement, but also in terms of getting a lot of their heavy hitters back that could help rebuild Hamas. Israel will withdraw fully from Gaza at the end of phase two. So after all the hostages and all the dead bodies are supposed to be released. That includes the Philadelphia corridor, which was the main sticking point that prevented a deal from being achieved back in July. So that is a sort of capitulation for Israel. On day 16 of the first phase, negotiations will begin over phase two. Hamas will definitely be seeking guarantees to make sure that when phase one is over, phase two will be pursued. A lot of that will depend on how interested Trump is in making sure that this continues. My guess is what it looks like he's very interested in it continuing, and therefore we'll probably see a relatively smooth transition between phase one and phase two. Granted, this is only speculation. Gazans will be allowed to return to their homes in the north, something that Israel had tried to prevent in the past. It looks like only vehicles will be checked, so individuals coming back by foot will not be checked. That's a sort of Israeli capitulation. It won't be long, of course, before the north becomes very much rebuilt in terms of Hamas terrorist infrastructure. As we'll discuss later in this episode, there's already a lot of that going on right now. Now, the IDF will completely withdraw at the end of phase two. That includes any idea that Israel had of having a sort of security zone remaining on Philadelphia, etc. So everything will be removed. All the IDF units will be removed, and Gaza will be rebuilt. At whose expense exactly, at what pace, how that's going to happen, that's unclear. That will be negotiated probably during phase two. What's interestingly missing from the releases is phase three. Phase three, the negotiations over that focused on the rebuilding of Gaza and on replacing Hamas as a government. I think in all the haste to reach a deal before Trump comes in, that was mostly abandoned in the talks in Doha. The talks will have to occur regarding that. That will probably occur during phase two. Overall, the deal is very similar to the one in July. The Israeli position has gotten worse on a few things, especially checking civilians going back to their homes. It looks like it's gotten a little bit worse on civilians, but the real major difference between this deal and the other deal is that there's less hostages alive. Quite a few hostages have died in the interim. We don't know exactly how many. Um, and that is a tragic outcome. Not to mention, of course, all the innocent civilians in Gaza and the IDF soldiers that have died in the meantime. Now, Netanyahu briefed journalists as a senior source, as I said, and told them, quote, the IDF will not leave until the last hostage is out, end quote. And that's trying to spin it as Israel is standing up for the hostages, making sure they will all come out, and that's true. But it's also an admission that Israel will be leaving Gaza fully, which is something that Netanyahu has previously insisted that Israel won't do, and is essentially the difference between an Israeli victory and an Israeli defeat. Is Hamas going to be allowed to rule all of Gaza um, on its own? That seems to be the case. Netanyahu's people have also briefed journalists saying that the May-July negotiations, at that time, Hamas was running a facade of negotiations, and now they're running actual negotiations. How true that is debatable. Of course, we'll never know because the deal was not reached. But as I said, the Philadelphia corridor was a major obstacle at that time. Now, what about the domestic Israeli politics surrounding this? Obviously, one of the major factors that's prevented a deal in the past was the Ben-Gvir Smotrich axis that was against a deal. Now, a few things have changed since then. Gidon Sa'ar was brought into the government, buttressing the numbers of the government, and um, other members of Knesset were separated from their um, uh, from their parties, including Dan Roll and Almog Cohen from the extreme right wing party. And that has given Netanyahu the numbers that he needs to pass the hostage deal, even with the opposition of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Now, Ben-Gvir has remained ominously silent on this. He's held consultations with various rabbis, members of his party. Most of the other members of his party want to leave. He may choose to remain. We don't know yet. But Smotrich and his party have decided not to leave the government. Simcha Rotman has voted in favor of leaving, but Smotrich wanted the party to remain, and he won the vote. So what Smotrich is going to do is he's going to vote against the deal. He's already come out with a tweet against it, so he's definitely going to vote against it, but he's not going to lead. Gideon Sa'ar will vote for it. Netanyahu will have the numbers. Netanyahu will try to keep Ben Gvir in the party, in the coalition. Unclear if he'll succeed, but he doesn't need him anymore. Now he has Gideon Sa'ar to make up the numbers. Netanyahu is going to try to sell this domestically first with the popularity of bringing home the hostages, and then he will try to cash in on this deal with Trump and get an attack on Iran and get an annexation of the West Bank, or at least the West Bank settlements. That will silence the right wing base. That might get Ben Gvir to remain in the government. And that way he can try to present holistically the entire war as a victory. So the narrative would be something like this: we killed Sinwar, we killed Nasrallah, we defeated Hezbollah, we got the hostages back, we annexed the West Bank, and we destroyed the Iranian nuclear program. We've transformed the Middle East. Lebanon now has a new president. Syria has a new president. We've transformed the Middle East in our favor. This war was a success. That will be the narrative. And honestly, I wouldn't be too surprised if it succeeded. Meanwhile, today, five Israeli soldiers were killed in Bet Hanun. At first, the reports were that it was a booby trap. Now, IDF is saying that it was some kind of accident with explosives from the IDF. That brings the number of Israeli soldiers killed in Bet Hanun to over 50 soldiers. And especially now, if there is a ceasefire, this battle will be a defeat because Israel left Bet Hanun, went back in, has fought against the Hamas terrorists there, has lost a lot of soldiers, destroyed the entire town, and still Hamas remain standing. So Hamas will be able to show that as a victory, Israel withdrawing under fire. Hamas will say we've won the battle of Beit Hanun, which will probably be the way that they sell this um, this victory to their people. We got the IDF to withdraw. They withdrew under fire. We beat them in Bet Hanun. They're hoping that that will be enough to keep them in power um, after Israel withdraws. Unfortunately, they may be right. The combination of a sort of military victory with the force of coercion that they can bring to bear against their own people might be enough to keep them in power. Okay, so that's the end of this video. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. Consider listening to my History of the Land of Israel podcast. And I'm sure I'll be here again very soon because a lot of things are happening.